And as we go forward, the reality is there's an awful lot of other countries in the world that are in the same problem, and they're going to be looking at immigrants as well. Aboriginal population, regardless of age, is underrepresented in the workforce. And that could be a very significant opportunity for dealing with the labor force shortage. And I know I don't have to say it for this group, but what you see is the correlation between literacy and employment by group, right? Literacy becomes the common thread, whether it's immigrant, Aboriginal, whether it's persons with disabilities. Huge variation there. Normal population in terms of a comparative group, 77% in the workforce. People with disabilities, about 55%. And there's huge variations depending on what the nature of the disability is. Some organizations are recognizing that an investment into people with disabilities actually pays off. Some of the research, for example, is showing, and again, there's training costs involved, that's accepted. But some of the research is showing people with disabilities become far more loyal and far more productive than it was ever imagined. And I think that's a trend we're going to see emerge. The other three groups I've talked about, youth, women, and older workers. For the women, it doesn't need to be said, there's huge improvements in labor force participation rate, but there's still issues around social responsibilities and how those are dealt with, and those have an impact on lower female participation rates. So that's something that could be addressed. The one on younger workers, it's a nice thing of being retired, because you can say things now that you couldn't have said when you were employed in a college, right? It's liberating. It's absolutely liberating. So, this is youth, 15 to 24. I've already said earlier, yes, we want them in school. We got to have them in school. But our current educational model is built on an agrarian society where you go to school for 8 months and then you get off for 4 so you can go into the fields and harvest. Right? That was a very legitimate model 100 years ago. I'd argue it's probably less of a model now. That paradigm has been shifted to go to school for 8 months, get out, work for a summer, make enough money so you can go back to school next 8 months, and cycle your way through. If we have a shortage of workers and highly educated youth are part of the solution, one of the options is to accelerate the programs. Go to school 2 summers out of 4 and you get out a year earlier. You end up having less student debt. You get into the workforce a year earlier, so you're earning income a year earlier. And you've been able to accelerate your whole program, degree, diploma, and still had a couple months off to work part-time. More university-college cooperation. It's embarrassing. You should absolutely be embarrassed by the lack of cooperation that occurs across the country in terms of colleges and universities. The issue of transfer credits is a national disgrace. So what we end up doing is we end up saying to a college grad, I'm sorry, that was a pretty interesting 3 years you did. I'm very pleased to let you know that you can come to school and enter year 1. Doesn't make sense at all. And it's a shame. Yes, there has to be some discerning of what can apply and what can't apply, but there are institutions in this country who have a policy of 0 transfer credit for somebody coming out of college. Not good. There is, interestingly, a very interesting call for reinstitution of the old 3-year baccalaureate degree. And actually that has some interesting opportunities to it. Do you know where the major source of students from Seneca College are? York University. York University is the biggest source of students at Seneca College. They have a very good program, they get a very good degree, and then they go out and say, uh-oh, I think I need something more specific. And whether they come to Fleming or they come to Seneca or they go to Humber or they go somewhere else, they spend a year or 2 years there depending on the duration of their program. What happens? Student debt goes up. They're another 2 years before they get into the workforce. Well, what if you took a 3-year baccalaureate degree and combined it with a 1 or 2 year college program and maybe shaved off a summer in the process? All of a sudden, you're pretty close to a 4-year duration where somebody has both the critical thinking, analytical skills that come about through a baccalaureate program, but also have the applied skills. We should be having more of that, and we don't have enough of it. More coordination between high school, also an issue, and some of that is coming away through various projects. In Canada, the average high school graduation rate is 75%. In some places of the world, that's remarkably good. But keep in mind, 25% don't. Remember those earlier figures? We need 80% with a post-secondary credential or not, and all of a sudden we got 25% don't even have high school, much less have gone from high school to a credential. That's an attitude issue we've got to deal with. A recognition that education is going to be more and more and more important over time, and if the parents don't understand it and the kids don't understand it, we're in trouble. Time. Okay, we're fine. Older workers, I'll come back to that a bit, but they may actually be the salvation. But right now, we don't encourage people to work beyond 65. We, in fact, have some inhibitors in there, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But we need better work-life balance. It's interesting that a large portion of those people would like to be entrepreneurs. And there may be some interesting opportunities there. A lot of them want to give back. So you find mentoring options, something they're very interested in. And there's still issues around age discrimination. Literacy. I won't go through that, this audience knows. I mean, when 4 out of 10 Canadians struggle with low literacy rate and 6 out of 10 immigrants, we know we got a problem. And as I mentioned before, the jobs of the future are going to end up being layered. So you're going to have a literacy layer, essential skills layer, more targeted skills layer, etc. But that foundation of literacy is there. We don't invest enough in our own workforces. The payroll of Canadian businesses, only 1.5% goes into workplace training. In the US, 2.25, 2.5 are fairly typical. In Europe, it's over 3. We need to invest more in the workforce. So let's look at the magnitude. Don't even bother about this one. But what it's basically, there's 2 messages. There is going to be a need for more training, but it's doable because there's a lot of players at the table. Colleges, universities, unions, industry, private colleges, etc. And the second is, if you have limited resources, you're better off investing in your education literacy first than expanding the size of your workforce, because it cuts down on some of the social disruptions. So just take that for a given. So where do we stand? I know we have people from Atlantic Canada, I think from Quebec, and Ken and Chris said to say hello, Zoe. That'll only mean something to one person here. This is interesting in the participation rate projections by province. We've got Canada on the right side, and then you can look at your own province, and you look at 05 versus 31, and you basically see all the participation rates drop. But the interesting thing of that, and I don't have the US slide, if you have the US slide, it's much more variable by state. And actually their participation rates are higher than Canadian rates. But we're seeing the drop, and we're seeing that everybody is more or less the same. New Brunswick has a bit of more of a problem, Nova Scotia has more of a problem, and Newfoundland has more. These were labor force participation rates in May. I wanted to get that kind of as part of the recessionary data. Pretty similar. Here's a very interesting statistic. I do not like the name, but I haven't come up with a better one yet. It's called the dependency ratio. It asks the following question. What percent of your population is over 65 or under 15? With the assumption being that if you're over 65, it's less likely you're working. You're more likely taking health benefits or some other kind of social benefits. If you're under 15, it's more likely you're in school and not working. So right now, in a Canadian context, we have 44% of our population, that's your far right, that is over 65 or under 15 compared to the workforce population. By 2031, that number grows to 61%. If you're sitting in Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, or Newfoundland, it's close to 70%. So how many of us think that 30% of our population will be able to financially support the other 70%? No. I gave, as Tony said, I gave this presentation to a group of college students a couple months ago. And when I got to, before I got to this point, they were happy. I mean, they were smiling. They were 21 years old. They were just about ready to graduate. They didn't think life could get any better. And I showed this slide, and all of a sudden, in about half of them, they started frowning. And they kept looking up and looking around. So for the other half that weren't frowning, I said, who do you think's going to pay for my health care? Oh my God, it's our problem too. It's everybody's problem. It's everybody's problem. Unless change occurs, it's everybody's problem. Nobody's going to get a free ride here. Educational attainment, pretty consistent across the country. If you did that same slide in the U.S., it would be scary. Huge variations, huge variations. I think Mississippi has a 25% educational attainment level. Huge difference. They've really got some issues that are going to be coming down the road. So what should we consider as we go forward? One of the things is, this data may appear old because it is old, because that's the most recent data published by Stats Canada in the workforce survey. They're supposed to have a new data set coming out. But what it shows is about 25% of the jobs change every 2 years, sorry. About 10% of all careers change every 2 years. So every time you hear the change word, think about literacy, think about skills development, think about education, because they usually precede those, or they're in between two employment situations. So what should we do in that regard when we look forward? If I was an individual, high school graduation is an absolute must. There still will be some jobs for people who only have a high school diploma, but fewer and fewer and fewer of them. Post-secondary completion will be increasingly necessary. We've talked about that. Accelerated programs will be extremely desirable. We had the second career programs in Ontario over the last couple of years, and what those people wanted was to get in and get out. The model of come in and take a summer off and then finish it off. No. We want to get in, we want to get out, we want to get back to work. And that's going to be more and more and more common. Continuous learning, and you talk about that all the time. In your profession, the movement in careers and jobs and more complex retirement. Educational institutions, they just got to be more flexible. This response that says, oh, you're interested in this? Yeah, well, you can join January, or you can join in September. They don't want to join January, September. They want to join now. And that's one of the advantages the private career colleges have. And unless there's some change in our post-secondary system, you're going to see growth in the private career colleges. They want more modularized on-site delivery, a shift in the type of students you're going to have, and just better coordination between all the institutional providers. And the employers on the recruitment side, I've talked to a lot of employers, and after this presentation, they get depressed. They get depressed for two reasons. One reason is they realize they really don't understand the dynamics of their own workforce. How many people are going to retire? When are they going to retire? What areas are they going to retire in? So that human resource planning function was not given as much priority as it should. Second thing, they realize that they're going to be competing far more for people in the workforce than they've ever had. I talked to a woman who ran a U.S. firm, or still is, running a U.S. firm in Toronto, small firm, and I said, so why are you in Toronto? I mean, you don't do enough business here to stay in Canada.